Blood on the freezing cobblestones was a common sight in the wretched fiefdom of Ethelgard, but the crimson seeping from Rowena's split lip was entirely fresh. Her mother's hazelwood cane had seen to that. But today, the iron portcullis shrieked open, and the north's apex predator came collecting. The bitter wind of late autumn howled through the poorly chinked walls of the stone cottage, but it was nothing compared to the chill inside. Rowena knelt on the hearth, her raw, blistered hands scrubbing the ash from the flagstones. Her knees, bruised purple and yellow against the hard rock, ached with a dull, familiar throbbing. "You missed a spot, you wretched, useless girl." The voice cut through the quiet crackle of the fire like a serrated blade. Beatrice, Rowena's mother, sat in a high-backed wooden chair. Once the wife of a respected knight, Beatrice's status had crumbled when her husband died of the sweating sickness, leaving her with nothing but a draughty manor, mounting debts, and a daughter she despised. She blamed Rowena for her fall from grace, viewing the girl not as flesh and blood, but as a burden that had drained her youth and prospects. Rowena didn't look up. She scrubbed harder, the coarse bristles of the brush tearing at her own skin. "I am sorry, Mother. The soot is baked into the stone." Thwack! The hazelwood cane came down hard across Rowena's shoulder blades. A sharp gasp escaped her lips, but she swallowed the scream. Crying only ever bought her a second strike. "Do not answer back to me," Beatrice hissed, rising from her chair. She loomed over her daughter, her sharp, gaunt face twisted in a sneer. "You are as insolent as you are plain. It is a miracle Magistrate Harland is even willing to look at you. Most men would want a dowry, but he is willing to clear my debts simply to take you off my hands." Rowena's blood ran cold. She finally looked up, her grey eyes wide with terror. Magistrate Harland was a corpulent, cruel man in his 50s, known throughout Ethelgard for his ruthless taxation and the bruised, weeping serving girls who frequently fled his estate in the dead of night. "Mother, please," Rowena whispered, her voice trembling. "Do not send me to him. I will work harder. I will take on mending for the blacksmith. I will scrub the tavern floors." "You will do as you are told," Beatrice roared, raising the cane again. This time, the wood connected with Rowena's cheek, splitting her lip and sending her sprawling onto the ash-covered floor. The metallic taste of blood flooded her mouth. "Harland comes tonight to finalize the contract. You will wash your face, put on the blue linen gown, and you will smile. If you ruin this for me, I swear to the Maker, I will lock you in the root cellar until winter takes you." Rowena lay there, staring at the dust motes dancing in the dim light. She knew her mother was entirely serious. Beatrice possessed a cruelty that was meticulously cold. It wasn't born of sudden rage, but of a deep, festering resentment. Rowena was a commodity, and today she was being sold. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Ethelgard. Before Beatrice could issue another command, the heavy, mournful blast of the watchtower horn echoed through the valley. It wasn't the short, sharp staccato that signaled a merchant caravan, nor the two blasts that warned of bandits. It was a single, deep, continuous note that rattled the glass in the window panes and made the dogs in the village begin to howl in a frenzied panic. The decennial tithe. Beatrice dropped her cane, her face draining of all color. "No," she breathed, rushing to the narrow window. "It has only been 9 years. It's too soon. They aren't due for another year." But the Lycans of the Ironwood clan didn't care for human calendars. Rowena pushed herself up, wiping the blood from her chin with the back of her soot-stained sleeve. For centuries, the northern realms had lived under the shadow of the beastmen. A treaty, forged in blood and terror long before Rowena was born, dictated that the human settlements must offer a tithe to the Lycan king to prevent their towns from being razed to the ash. Grain, livestock, gold, and sometimes, if the king demanded it, human servants. The ground began to vibrate. It was a subtle tremor at first, felt only in the soles of the feet, but it grew rapidly into a thunderous, rhythmic pounding. "Get up!" Beatrice snapped, her previous anger replaced by frantic self-preservation. She grabbed Rowena by the arm, hauling her to her feet, her nails digging into the girl's bruised flesh. "We must go to the square. If we are not present for the king's inspection, we will be branded as deserters and hanged by the magistrate before the wolves even reach us. Wash your face! Quickly!" 10 minutes later, Rowena was dragged into the freezing, muddy streets. Ethelgard was in utter chaos. Merchants were desperately attempting to hide their finest wares, while mothers clutched their children to their chests, weeping openly. The rain began to fall in a freezing, misty drizzle, turning the cobblestones slick. They reached the central square just as the heavy iron portcullis of the village gates shrieked open. The town militia, men who usually swaggered with unearned pride, stood rigidly, their spears trembling in their hands. Through the fog and the rain, the Ironwood clan entered. They did not march like a human army. They moved with a predatory, synchronized grace that made the hair on the back of Rowena's neck stand up. Dozens of massive men and women, clad in dark leathers, furs, and heavy iron plating, rode atop monstrous, thick-muscled war horses. They possessed a wild, untamed beauty, but their eyes, gold, amber, and piercing green, were those of apex predators. At the vanguard rode the Alpha King, Gideon of the Ironwood. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered, and radiating a heat that seemed to cut through the freezing rain. His raven-dark hair was pulled back, revealing a chiseled face marred only by a pale, jagged scar that slashed across his jawline. He wore a heavy cloak of black wolf fur over a forged iron breastplate. He didn't carry a shield. The massive broadsword strapped to his back was clearly all he required. The entire village fell to their knees. The silence that swept over the square was absolute, broken only by the snorting of the Lycan war horses and the driving rain. Beatrice dragged Rowena down into the mud, forcing the girl's head down. "Keep your eyes on the dirt," Beatrice hissed in Rowena's ear. "Do not look at them." Magistrate Harland, sweating profusely despite the cold, stepped forward from the line of shivering town elders. He was clutching a heavy oak ledger and a velvet pouch that clinked with the sound of gold. He bowed so deeply, his fleshy chin nearly touched his knees. "Your Grace," Harland stammered, his voice cracking. "King Gideon, we did not expect you for another year. The harvest has been poor, and the winter—" Gideon raised a single, leather-clad hand. Harland's mouth snapped shut so fast his teeth clicked. The Alpha King swung down from his massive destrier. His boots hit the mud with a heavy, deliberate thud. He didn't look at the gold Harland was offering. He didn't look at the wagons of grain the militia had hurriedly wheeled into the square. He simply stood there, his golden eyes sweeping over the kneeling, terrified populace. "The treaty stated we would return in 10 years. Gideon's voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried easily over the wind. It was calm, yet layered with an authority that demanded absolute obedience. "But your borders have grown lax, Magistrate Harland. My scouts found poachers from Ethelgard hunting in the Ironwood 3 nights ago." Harland turned the color of old parchment. "Sire, I swear to you, I knew nothing of this. They were rogues, outlaws. They were your citizens," Gideon interrupted smoothly, stepping closer to the trembling magistrate. "And they killed a doe that belonged to my lands. The price for breaking the treaty is steep. Your gold does not interest me today." A collective gasp rippled through the kneeling crowd. If the Lycans did not want gold or grain, they wanted blood. Gideon began to walk the line of kneeling villagers. The tension was suffocating. Rowena kept her eyes firmly locked on a cracked cobblestone, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could smell the king as he drew closer, a scent of pine needles, wood smoke, and an underlying metallic tang of raw power. Suddenly, the Alpha King stopped. He was standing no more than 10 feet away from where Rowena and Beatrice knelt on the fringes of the crowd. The air around him seemed to crackle, thick and heavy. Gideon turned his head slowly, his nostrils flaring slightly. He was scenting the air. Rowena's breath hitched. She felt an inexplicable, terrifying pull in her chest, a strange warmth that defied the freezing rain. Beatrice, sensing the king's pause near them, panicked. She believed the king was looking at them because of Rowena's unkempt appearance, or perhaps he smelled the blood still weeping from the girl's split lip, finding them an insult to his presence. Desperate to deflect any wrath, Beatrice's self-preservation instincts turned vicious. "Straighten your back, you miserable wretch," Beatrice hissed venomously, gripping Rowena's shoulder and digging her nails in hard. "You shame me even in the mud." Rowena winced, her bruised knees slipping on the wet stones, causing her to stumble forward slightly, breaking the perfectly straight line of kneeling peasants. Beatrice lost her temper entirely. Forgetting the towering Lycan king standing just yards away, she reacted as she always did in the privacy of their home. She raised her hazelwood cane, bringing it down viciously aimed at the back of Rowena's head. "I told you to keep still," Beatrice snarled. Rowena squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the crack of wood against her skull. The blow never landed. A sound like splitting timber echoed through the square. Rowena opened her eyes. King Gideon stood directly over her. He had moved with a speed that defied human comprehension, crossing the distance in a blur. One of his massive, gauntleted hands had caught the cane mid-swing. The thick hazelwood was crushed in his grip, splintering into jagged shards under the sheer force of his clench. Beatrice stared up at him, her mouth opening and closing in mute, absolute horror. The cane dropped from her trembling fingers. Gideon did not look at the mother. His glowing, golden eyes were locked entirely on Rowena. For a moment, time seemed to freeze in Ethelgard. The rain stopped registering. The terrified whispers of the crowd faded to nothing. Rowena looked up into the face of the Alpha King, expecting to see monstrous rage. Instead, she saw a storm of conflicting emotions, shock, deep recognition, and a fiercely possessive, burning intensity that terrified her in a completely different way. He knelt, the iron of his armor groaning. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushing against the swollen, bleeding cut on her lip. A low, terrifying growl rumbled deep within his chest, vibrating through the wet cobblestones. It wasn't directed at Rowena. It was directed at the blood on her face. Gideon stood back, up to his full, towering height. He turned his gaze upon Beatrice. The air pressure in the square seemed to drop. The killing intent radiating from the Alpha was so potent that several villagers nearby fainted. "You dare," Gideon whispered. The softness of his voice was infinitely more terrifying than a roar. "You dare strike what is mine!" Beatrice scrambled backward in the mud, weeping hysterically. "Mercy! Mercy, your grace! She is just a useless girl. She is my daughter. She is nothing to you anymore." Gideon cut her off, his voice echoing like thunder in a canyon. He turned his attention to Magistrate Harland, who looked ready to soil himself. "Magistrate," Gideon commanded, "this woman is stripped of whatever meager titles and lands she holds. Her property is forfeit to the crown. If I ever hear that she has touched a silver coin again, I will return and hold you personally responsible." Harland bowed so fast he nearly head-butted the pavement. "Yes, Your Grace, immediately." Gideon looked back down at Rowena. He extended a massive, leather-gloved hand toward her. "Get up," he said softly. Rowena, trembling violently, reached out and placed her small, blistered hand in his. The moment their skin touched, a jolt of raw heat shot up her arm, settling deep in her chest. He pulled her to her feet effortlessly, drawing her close to his side. He dwarfed her entirely. "Wait!" Beatrice screamed from the mud, desperation making her foolish. "You cannot just take her. She is contracted. She has promised to Magistrate Harland to settle my debts." Gideon paused. He slowly turned his head, his golden eyes locking onto the magistrate. Harland began to vigorously shake his head, waving his hands in absolute terror. "No, no, no," Harland shrieked, his voice pitching high. "No contract. There is no contract, Your Grace. The girl is free to go. Completely free." Gideon sneered in disgust. He looked at his second-in-command, a towering Lycan warrior with a battle-axe strapped to his back. "We are done here. The tithe is collected." Before Rowena could even process the words, Gideon effortlessly lifted her off her feet, tossing her up onto the saddle of his massive war-horse. He swung up behind her, his large frame acting as a shield against the freezing wind. Where are you taking me?" Rowena whispered, her voice barely audible over the stomping of the retreating horses. Gideon leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. The heat of his breath made her shiver. "Home," the Alpha King whispered. "She's coming with me." The journey into the deep north was a blur of freezing wind and the terrifying, rhythmic thundering of Lycan warhorses. Rowena sat rigidly in front of King Gideon, her small, battered frame pressed against the solid wall of his iron breastplate. Despite the biting cold of the mountain passes, she did not shiver. The Alpha King radiated a supernatural, furnace-like heat that seeped through his heavy furs and wrapped around her like a protective mantle. They did not ride into a barbaric camp of tents and bone, as the terrified tales in Ethelgard always claimed. Instead, as they breached the crest of the final alpine ridge, the mist parted to reveal an architectural marvel. The ironwood stronghold was a colossal fortress carved directly into the living granite of the mountain. Its sweeping, Gothic spires pierced the low-hanging clouds, and massive drawbridges spanned roaring, glacial rivers. It rivaled the grandeur of the real, private Beaumont estate, the legendary southern sovereign lands known for their impenetrable walls and ancient wealth. When Gideon's destrier finally brought them into the central courtyard, the stronghold erupted into a flurry of organized activity. Massive Lycan warriors and lithe, sharp-eyed women bowed their heads in deep reverence as their king dismounted. Gideon reached up, placing his hands on Rowena's waist, and lifted her down to the paved stones with a gentleness that entirely contradicted his terrifying reputation. "Maud," Gideon's voice rumbled, echoing off the stone walls. An older woman, stout and entirely human in appearance, save for her striking amber eyes, stepped forward and curtsied. "My king." "Take her to the royal chambers," Gideon commanded, his gaze never leaving Rowena's bewildered face. "Draw a hot bath. Burn the rags she is wearing. Tend to her wounds. And Maud, if a single hair on her head is harmed within these walls, I will hold the entire household responsible." Rowena gasped softly, her grey eyes widening. The concept of being treated with care, let alone reverence, was completely alien to her. For the next 2 hours, she was whisked into a world of incomprehensible luxury. Maud led her to a cavernous stone chamber, warmed by a roaring hearth. She was bathed in steaming water, scented with crushed pine and lavender. As the soot and dried blood washed away, the horrific tapestry of her abuse was laid bare. Her back, arms, and ribs were painted in a sickening mosaic of purple bruises, raised welts, and silver scars. Maud did not gasp, but a low, dangerous growl vibrated in the back of the older woman's throat as she applied a cooling, herbal salve to Rowena's wounds. "The human woman who did this to you," Maud muttered, wrapping Rowena in a thick, silk-lined robe of deep forest green, "is lucky the king only took her lands. Had the clan known what she was doing to you, they would have rendered her to the bone." "I don't understand," Rowena whispered, clutching the rich fabric to her chest. "Why am I here? I am just a servant, a debtor's daughter." The heavy oak door to the chamber clicked open. Gideon stepped inside, having shed his armor for a simple linen tunic and dark leather breeches. Without the heavy iron plates, he looked even larger, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. Maud bowed deeply and silently exited the room, leaving them alone. Gideon walked slowly toward the hearth, the firelight catching the jagged pale scar on his jaw. He looked at Rowena, his golden eyes sweeping over her clean face and the rich green fabric that contrasted sharply with her pale, frightened features. "You are not a debtor's daughter, Rowena," Gideon said softly, his deep voice filling the quiet room. "And the woman you call mother is nothing but a parasite who stole you from your cradle." Rowena's breath hitched. She backed up a step, her mind spinning. "That is impossible. Beatrice was a barren, bitter, wet nurse employed by the private Beaumont estate," Gideon interrupted, taking a step closer. The intensity in his gaze pinned her in place. 18 years ago, my father's closest ally, Lady Rosalind Beaumont, fell in love with a Lycan general of the Ironwood. It was a union forbidden by human zealots. When the zealots discovered the affair, they besieged the Beaumont manor. Your father was slaughtered defending the gates. Rosalind died in childbirth. Rowena's hands trembled violently. The room seemed to tilt. No, I am human. I have no Lycan blood. I have no strength." Gideon reached out, his warm, calloused fingers gently tipping her chin up so she was forced to look into his glowing eyes. "Because Beatrice fed you wolfsbane," he stated, his voice tight with a barely restrained fury. "Every morning. That bitter tea she forced upon you to cure your sickly constitution. It is a poison to our kind. It kept your wolf dormant, suppressed your strength, and allowed her to subjugate you. She took the Lycan gold meant for your secret upkeep, squandered it on her failed husband's debts, and treated you worse than a stray dog." A sickening wave of realization crashed over Rowena. The daily, vile-tasting tea, the persistent, bone-deep aches she always felt when the moon was full, the strange, unnatural heat she felt the moment Gideon had touched her in the square. "When I walked into Ethelgard today," Gideon whispered, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone, "I wasn't looking for poachers. I was looking for the scent of the lost Beaumont heir. But what I found was my mate." The word hung in the air, heavy and charged with an ancient, undeniable magic. A Lycan's mate was their equal, their soul, their other half. To find one was a miracle. To find one battered and broken by a human was a tragedy that demanded absolute retribution. "You are safe now," Gideon promised, pulling her flush against his chest. The mate bond, no longer entirely suppressed by the poison in her veins, flared to life, filling her with a profound, intoxicating warmth. "You will never scrub another floor. You will never cower from a raised hand. You are the Luna of the Ironwood, and tomorrow the entire North will kneel to you." Word of the Alpha King claiming a battered, seemingly human girl from the southern fiefdoms spread through the stronghold like wildfire. While many of the Ironwood Lycans trusted Gideon's judgment implicitly, the old laws of the pack were steeped in dominance and blood. Weakness was a liability they could not afford, and to the traditionalists, a human Luna was an unacceptable vulnerability. The unrest culminated 3 nights later in the Great Hall. Rowena sat beside Gideon at the high table, dressed in an elegant gown of midnight blue velvet, her silver-white hair braided with diamond-dusted pins. She felt like an imposter. The wolfsbane was slowly leaving her system, plunging her body into a state of exhausting, feverish flux. Her senses were sharpening painfully. She could hear the heartbeats of the warriors pacing at the back of the hall, and the scent of roasted venison was almost overpowering. The heavy, iron-studded doors of the great hall suddenly burst open, silencing the low chatter of the feast. Lord Silas of the Crag Pack strode into the room. He was a massive, scarred Lycan, with eyes the colour of dirty ice, and a sneer permanently etched onto his face. He was accompanied by a dozen of his most brutal enforcers. Silas had long coveted Gideon's throne, and the arrival of a human queen was the perfect political leverage he had been waiting for. "King Gideon!" Silas bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He marched to the centre of the hall, ignoring the furious growls of Gideon's personal guard. "We have bled for the Ironwood. We have kept the borders secure from the human blight, and you insult our ancestors by dragging a bruised, fragile peasant into the Luna's seat." Gideon stood slowly. The air in the hall grew instantly suffocating. "Silas," Gideon warned, his voice dangerously quiet, "you forget your place. She is my mate." "She is a human pet," Silas spat, pointing a thick, clawed finger at Rowena. Rowena flinched, instinctively gripping the wooden armrests of her chair. "The ancient rites demand that the Luna be capable of defending the pack. I invoke the right of challenge. Cast the human out, or face me for the crown." Gasps erupted around the hall. The right of challenge was sacred. If Gideon refused, he forfeited his kingship. If he accepted, it was a battle to the death. Gideon didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his heavy sword belt, letting his weapon crash to the stone floor. "Clear the hall," he ordered. Rowena's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Gideon, no," she whispered, reaching for his arm. "He is trying to bait you. You don't have to do this." Gideon turned to her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "I must, Rowena. For them to accept you, I must show them what happens to those who question your place by my side." The center of the great hall was cleared. The 2 alphas circled each other, the air crackling with lethal intent. Silas shifted halfway, his fingernails elongating into thick, black talons, his jaw extending to reveal razor-sharp fangs. Gideon remained in his human form, his sheer physical power radiating like a dark storm. Silas lunged first. The clash was brutal and blindingly fast. The sound of fists impacting flesh and bone echoed like cannon fire. Gideon was faster and stronger, landing devastating blows that cracked Silas's ribs. But Silas was desperate and treacherous. As Gideon stepped in to deliver a finishing strike, Silas pulled a hidden dagger from his boot. The blade gleamed with a sickly, unnatural light. Silver. A treasonous, forbidden weapon in Lycan combat. Before Gideon could react to the foul play, Silas slashed the blade across Gideon's side. The Alpha King roared in agony, stumbling backward as the toxic metal burned through his flesh, neutralizing his rapid healing. Silas capitalized on the moment, tackling Gideon to the ground and raising the silver blade for a lethal strike to the throat. "No!" The scream that tore from Rowena's throat did not sound human. The last agonizing traces of the wolfsbane shattered under the sheer, desperate panic of the mate bond. The trauma, the fear, and 18 years of suppressed bloodline erupted all at once. Rowena vaulted over the high table. She didn't land with the clumsy frailty of a human girl. She landed gracefully on all fours, the stone cracking slightly beneath her hands. Silas froze, the silver dagger hovering inches from Gideon's neck. He turned his head, his icy eyes widening in absolute shock. Rowena stood up. The delicate, bruised peasant girl from Ethelgard was gone. Her grey eyes had transformed into pools of blinding, luminescent gold, the undeniable mark of a royal alpha bloodline. The sheer, oppressive aura of her dormant power flooded the great hall, so heavy and ancient that several of Silas's enforcers immediately dropped to their knees, whimpering as their instincts forced them to submit. "Get away from him," Rowena commanded. Her voice was layered with a terrifying, dual harmonic, the voice of a woman, underlaid with the visceral snarl of a massive wolf. Silas, paralyzed by the sudden, suffocating pressure of an alpha female of the Beaumont Lycan lineage, dropped the silver blade. His hubris crumbled into primal terror. He scrambled off Gideon, backing away slowly, exposing his throat in a desperate sign of submission. But treason had already been committed. Gideon, clutching his bleeding side, pushed himself up. He looked at Rowena, his golden eyes blazing with a mixture of immense pride and fierce love. He turned his gaze back to the cowering lord of the Crag Pack. With a single fluid motion, Gideon retrieved Silas's dropped silver dagger from the floor and drove it through the traitor's heart. Silas collapsed, dead before he hit the stones. Total silence blanketed the great hall. The scent of blood and ozone was thick in the air. Rowena stood amidst the carnage, her chest heaving, the golden light slowly fading from her eyes, back to a soft, stormy grey. She looked down at her hands, realizing for the first time the immense, terrifying strength that had always slept beneath her scars. The Lycan warriors, who moments ago had doubted her, lowered their heads. One by one they dropped to one knee, crossing their arms over their chests in the deepest sign of fealty. Gideon walked toward her, ignoring his own wound. He reached out, taking her trembling, blood-stained hands in his, and brought them to his lips. "My Luna," he whispered, his voice echoing in the absolute silence of the kneeling clan. Rowena looked out over the bowed heads of the fiercest predators in the north. She thought of Beatrice's hazelwood cane. She thought of Magistrate Harlan's cruel ledger. Those terrors felt 1,000 lifetimes away. She squeezed Gideon's hands, standing tall, finally stepping out of the shadows and into her rightful place. Rowena's journey from a battered servant to the revered Queen of the Ironwood stands as a true testament to pure resilience. Her story proves that true nobility is not defined by human titles, but by the strength of one's spirit. The scars of Ethelgard faded, replaced by the fierce, protective love of a Lycan king. In the heart of the ancient forest, the broken girl finally found her mighty roar,